Hello and welcome to another Cavell Cloud Conversations podcast with me, Finbarr, and Patrick as well. How are we doing, Patrick?
Hello, Finbarr. Very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm brilliant. We've had some actual sunshine in London, which is
Very rare.
funny. Yeah, rare and funny. I said this, it was raining yesterday, but it's been really nice. Kind of counter to, we'll say, the global clouds and thunderstorms of uncertainty. We're going to talk about cloud communications research in a second because I know everyone is interested, but I think it would be interesting to just spend a few minutes just talking about um, global uncertainty and how that affects the cloud comms market. Because, from our perspective over here in Europe, and I know some of our listeners from America definitely would be interested in hearing that take. All of this uncertainty on tariffs is affecting, shall we say, planning. Um, and people thinking about what solutions they're going to buy. What are you hearing from, our contacts in Germany, in the Nordics about their current thoughts on buying from US providers?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I know we'll come on to the cloud comms reports, but as the way that we create those research reports is we interview and survey. Well, this year we did more than 100 providers across sort of Cavell's key territories, so North America, Western Europe, the Nordics, and into APAC now as we've started to expand into APAC. And you're right, Finbar. It was we conducted this research at the start of the year, so we've slightly we were before all of the tariff drama, but nonetheless, I think one thing we definitely and in fairness, this has been happening for a number of years, that there has been definitely some resistance within Europe to using American companies, particularly France was an obvious example. There were educational establishments that were told that they were not to use Microsoft 365. But this year, that was really heightened with some of the, and obviously, Finbar, we are a strong politically neutral podcast, but with some of the rhetoric that was coming out of the White House at the start of 2025, what we heard from was increased hesitancy from European providers. Well, maybe not hesitancy, but increased questions over data sovereignty, data residency, and particularly in the Nordic countries, with I think the tensions over what the current US government have been saying about Greenland, which is obviously part of the Kingdom of Denmark. Some of the Nordic providers were already looking into redundancy options as to what they would have to do if they had to stop using American companies. So this is huge, because all of the tech firms, all of the productivity tools, you're either using Microsoft or Google or Zoom. There are a few open source options available from the rest of the world, but this causes a real problem. So sometimes we think these wider geopolitical comments and issues won't necessarily affect communications, but they really do. We heard from numerous providers and about their concerns over using US firms, and also we heard from a number of US firms who sell into Europe that they were getting increasing questions about, oh, where is my data? What are the options in terms of if we don't want the Patriot Act. We don't want data to go back to the US. Local encryption keys, local data residency and sovereignty, all of those things. So yeah, it really has ramped up in terms of the discussion.
I think it's just, I mean, Europe has always been to a certain extent. I don't want to say protectionist, but I guess it is protectionist in the sense that having a strong regional preference underscored by language and cultural differences. I mean, France is the classic example where you need the local provider. You want to hear French from whoever you're working with. You don't really want a support team that doesn't understand your cultural norms. And a lot of that is driven by actual practical things. I mean, the French labour market is highly different to the rest of the world in terms of, you're thinking about employee protections.
Yeah, very good employee protection.
They get,
yeah,
how many, like emailing a French worker after hours is actually illegal. All these things add up to, I guess, the perception that it might be hard for someone outside France to work with people in France, but then also that it's better to work with French companies. And the same is true to an extent of the other markets in Europe where they want to work with people from their own region who speak their own language and have the same culture. And I guess there are a lot of companies who were looking for any reason to keep business closer to home. And this has kind of given them that justification for buying into local products even more and embracing that kind of protectionist approach, which is very interesting. But as you say, I mean, the core, whether you think what's happening is good or bad, because we are politically neutral, it is more of a question of, are things uncertain? I think everyone could agree they are. And that uncertainty leads to questions about future planning. And as you say, it doesn't mean that people aren't going to buy Microsoft, but it does mean that the people we talk to who are buying and selling Microsoft are very much talking about which data center things are going to be hosted in, which they always were to an extent. But it is more, does this application call back to an American server? Does this application send data to an American AI engine? Or is it all done in country, in data center? How do we keep control of that? Which I think is very interesting.
Yeah, and that's a really fair point. This has always been a live discussion, but I think what's happened over the last 6 months, as you say, has just sort of heightened that. And to your point, it has created greater hesitancy. And we, in all of the interviews and the surveys that we've done for the Cloud Comms reports, we generally heard about a slight slowing in the market in terms of uptake. So I think all of this uncertainty, this geopolitical and now wider macroeconomic, I think turmoil is a fair description, has caused greater hesitancy, and it will slow market growth down. You know, if you're particularly in a large enterprise or a public sector organization, if you were thinking about refreshing your communications estate, this might not be the time to do it. If you can sweat your existing assets for a little bit longer, considering what's going on at the moment in terms of uncertainty, that's probably what you're likely to do. So that is what we heard from a lot of providers, that they were hearing, you know, deals slow down, deals be deferred because of sort of very uncertain times that we're in at the moment.
Yeah, and I mean, the reality as well is that we do have homegrown solutions, but not for everything. A lot of the tech that people rely on is generated in America. And, you know, the worry about tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs, things like that are obviously just a concern. So let's move on from macroeconomics before we get ourselves in trouble, and move to a nice safe topic, which is our cloud comms research. Patrick, you've recently done the cloud comms research. Do you want to kind of start off with a high level understanding of your methodology? Like, why is this like the good research that people should listen to?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the core tranche of Cavell research that we've been conducting for more than a decade now, looking at business telephony markets, primarily in our core markets, so Western Europe, North America, the Nordics. We've expanded into APAC. We do actually hold global data now across more than 190 countries, but we specifically look in detail at Western European, North American markets. And we do that in a sort of composite of different ways, but primarily by speaking to providers in the market. So in the US, for example, we track more than 400 cloud communications providers. In the UK, it's more than 100. And every year we speak to, you know, a select few, the vendors, key service providers, tier 1 and tier 2 telcos, to see what they have been seeing in the market over a 6-month period. So we run this research biannually, so twice a year, and the latest reports run up until the end of 2024. So the last 6 months of 2024. And generally what we heard was a bit, I think the sort of key headlines, bit of a slowdown in the market generally, people maybe not seeing the growth rates they had previously. And that's partly because some of the factors that we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, but also a lot of the markets, if you look at the US or you look at the UK or the Netherlands or Spain, for example, out of the total number of business telephony users within that market, our forecasts show that actually more than 50% of the users within those markets are already using a cloud-based PBX system for their communications. So they're already using a publicly hosted multi-tenant cloud PBX or UCaaS solution for their communications. And as those markets reach that sort of level of maturity, growth slows naturally anyway. It's one of the, we use for all our forecasting sort of technology S curves in terms of adoption. So as those markets reach high levels of maturity, growth tends to slow on a sort of natural level anyway. So yeah, we interview these providers. We ask them about what sort of growth they're seeing, what trends they're seeing impacting the market. And I think sort of key headlines that we heard, particularly in the developed markets, so UK, US, but also other developed European markets like the Netherlands, growth slightly slowing, different sort of price commoditization, particularly around UCaaS, prices being driven down as people look to your area, Finbarr, look to customer experience as an alternative margin and revenue generation stream, and a couple of other key trends as well. It's increasingly difficult, we think, to differentiate on a pure UCaaS proposition. So we've seen more and more providers look at vertical markets, and I know you've done a lot of research as well looking at this.
Yeah, I mean, the vertical markets thing is quite interesting because, as you say, we're reaching this point where saturation of the people who need to buy a cloud PBX and a cloud comm solution has kind of got quite high. But we're also reaching this point of, it's a bit of a kind of challenge, is that as technology gets more complex, you'd imagine deployments would get more complex. But the reality is that as you start to automate and bring in AI and automated solutions into these products, the configuration actually and deployment of them becomes easier. The production of new features becomes easier. So really what you have is a situation where there's a lot of feature convergence on all of these platforms because building the new feature is not as difficult as it used to be. Training your sales team how to sell it isn't as difficult as it used to be. And then, of course, deploying it isn't as difficult as it used to be. Where people are finding the secret sauce, especially in CCAS, though I know we're talking about the cloud comms reports, is in this vertical focus and vertical specialization. And that is really just a practical challenge, right? Because the quality and the needs of the UCaaS platform inside a hospital environment, for example, inside a financial services environment, are just drastically different. You know, we're talking about practical solutions like fidelity of recordings, how call recordings are handled, how compliance is handled. Do you need to add a mask that covers up payment information from the call recording so it isn't captured, right? All of these questions that have to be handled on a vertical by vertical basis still require a hands-on approach to not only understand, but also deploy. And that's kind of allowing service providers to carve out their niche. And to your point about CCaaS, if you have a niche in a specific vertical selling UCaaS and you understand that vertical's needs from a communications perspective, those needs will translate to what they need from their CCaaS platform as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I was talking to a CEO of one of the market's leading UCaaS. Well, they're a UCCC converged company the other week. And he was saying from a feature function perspective, if one of his competitors brings out a new feature or function, you can get a dedicated dev team to pretty much catch up and speed develop that feature within weeks. You know, it is not difficult to catch up in terms of features and functions. So the verticalization piece, and there's some really interesting research that we did in the Cloud Comms reports where we asked service providers, how are you differentiating by verticals? And I think that it's really important to draw a distinction here, because what we found was that 90% of the communications vendors, service providers and telcos that we speak to, so 90% have some sort of vertical marketing collateral. So they have a case study in healthcare, or they have a case study for retail. But then actually, when you start to dive a bit deeper and say, okay, you've got a case study, how many of you actually have off-the-shelf or bespoke vertical software integration? So as you say, into a particular healthcare application, only 46% of those communication providers said that they had developed that capability. And then if you take it one stage further and say, okay, how many of you have a dedicated specialized sales, technical or support teams that specialize in those vertical markets? Only around a quarter of those service providers or telcos or communications vendors actually had that. So everyone's talking about verticals, but actually there are different tiers of vertical specialization that allow you to differentiate in different ways.
I think that's really fascinating, because it's easy enough to put together a marketing campaign talking about how great you are with a healthcare provider. but actually training your sales team to go into that market, understand that market, you have to really have confidence that your product is a special fit. Otherwise, you're investing a lot of resources in giving someone that niche. And I think maybe that's something people are a bit worried about. If you've got a new healthcare specialist, they're going to have to invest a lot of time meeting those potential customers, going to those conferences, doing all of that work.
Yeah, completely. It requires. I mean, I used to work in a past life in a sort of dedicated public sector team, but you're absolutely right. You have to dedicate all of that team's time to working in that particular sector. So you're writing off, the rest of the market in order to have that specialization. So you're absolutely right. There's a sacrifice there required in order to sort of differentiate. But that was just. I mean, we talked about a couple of the trends. So as I said, the sort of overall cloud communications market slowing slightly. And for anyone who wants the sort of detailed information, all of our reports come with our background data sheets on a sort of country level where we forecast out for 5 years, split by business segment. So you could look in the US and look at how the enterprise segment's forecast to grow, or the SME segment. But those were just a couple of the key trends. We looked at vertical focus. We looked at channel and go to market, providers focusing on global expansion. We looked at a whole section on pricing, and pricing, Finbarr, is something that's really interesting because I know you're focused on the CCaaS space, where currently the sort of price resilience is there is a fair amount of price resilience. In UCaaS, we're seeing prices really commoditized, and quite often the UCaaS aspect of a deal, or the UC aspect of a deal, is being incredibly heavily discounted in order to try and win the CCaaS or contact center side of a particular deal. So there's lots of really interesting trends that we talked about in the reports. And I think hopefully for anyone, either vendor, service provider, telco, even if you're a managed service provider, there'd be a lot of stuff in these reports that would be useful for your sort of go-to-market success over the next few years.
Yeah, I mean, it's a scary proposition to hear that your part of the market is being commoditized. But then I guess, A, that's been happening for a while, so you probably do already know about it, and B, buy our reports to find out what the hell you should do about it. I think this has been a really good dive. I mean, obviously we got distracted a little bit by the current state of the world at the start, but I mean, these reports really are sort of a flagship moment of the year for us, in terms of highlighting things that we think you need to know. Like we're not wasting words on things we think aren't relevant to the industry. So I would say if you're thinking strategically, which you probably are always doing, then it would be a good idea to get in touch with us about them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if anyone wants any details on inclusion, what's included in the report, what's included in the data set, please do get in touch with us. There's sample reports available. We can make available sample data sets so you can see exactly what would be included on a sort of country by country level. But if anyone has questions on, will this data point be included? Have you looked at this? Please just reach out, head to the Cavell website, go to the contact us section, get in touch, ask the question. And, we'd love to jump on a call, take you through what's included in the reports. They're all available immediately now via our customer portal for anyone who's interested in purchasing them. But as you said, any sort of questions or areas of interest, I'd love to chat to anyone who's interested in them.
Brilliant. Well, as always, this has been Finbarr and Patrick from Cavell, two leading, we'll say, market research analysts focused on the business communications market, CCaaS, UCaaS, all sorts of cloud communications and collaboration. Hopefully you've enjoyed this. If you have, do give us a comment, a like. Any feedback is valuable. And if you have any ideas for topics you'd like to hear us cover, or if you think there are topics that you'd like more information on from the podcast, do just get in touch via LinkedIn, or if you've got our emails, you can drop us an email as well. Great to speak to you all again.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Finbarr.